Thank you so much for the really kind, wonderful introduction, and thank you all for joining us across time zones and changing clocks and places and spaces. It's really a wonderful opportunity to be able to reach so many folks doing such different kinds of things in different places and finding something that sort of unifies us to have these kinds of discussions. So today we're going to talk about sort of some of the community-driven projects that we've been working on. Katie will introduce one, and I'll introduce one as well too. But just to give you a background on who we are sort of institutionally at the Ohio State Center for Folklore Studies, Folklore Archives. We have extensive collections of Ohio folk songs and music, local and Midwest folk narratives, oral histories, documentation of folk customs, beliefs and practices, and material culture. So things that are generally within the range of sort of folklore collections and archives. These have been generated since the mid-1960s by folklore faculty at Ohio State University, by students who take folklore classes, both undergraduate and graduate students, and fieldwork generated collections that we've either acquired, that were done by other nonprofit or folklore related organizations in Ohio, or done by folklorists who were contracted out by either the American Folklore Society, the Ohio Arts Council, or by the Center for Folklore Studies itself. And so that really is more than 35,000 items that we have in our collections that have been sort of collected since the 1960s and are sort of one of the last folklore-specific repositories in the state of Ohio. This all fits into our land-grant university mission. Ohio State University is what's referred to as a land-grant university, meaning that it has a specific mission to a charter essentially to serve the public of Ohio. So we think of our folklore collection fundamentally as always serving the public in Ohio in any way that we can do that. That's really what sort of comes first in our idea. And in the background there is our archives building at the time being. It's the football stadium. We were inside the American Football Stadium, which is one of the largest stadiums in the world. And sort of tucked into one of those little holes that you can see down there is where our folklore archives have been housed for the past 15 years. And this year, actually, we're moving to another place on campus, a much more suitable place to work in for us, which means this is a sort of inflection point for us, a point where we're sort of taking stock of what we have and what we do and thinking about who we are as an institution at the Center for Folklore Studies Archives. Although the football stadium has been very good for us because it is a center of folklore in Ohio. Fan folklore, the team folklore, the band, everything that happens in that, you know, when as every Saturday for 4 or 5 months out of the year, 100,000 people come to the same exact place, you know that there's some really interesting folklore happening in that space. But so I'll pass over to Katie to talk a little bit more sort of theoretically about what we do as a folklore archive.
Okay. Oh, look at that. Yeah, so what kind of archive are we? I think that's where I'd like to start. We have the idea of institutional archives and at Ohio State, we have a huge library and they have a university collection, special collections. You know, we have the idea of the archives of Seville, which is related to, you know, conquest and control of populations. And the places like where Suzanne is talking from, you know, national folklore archives that again are kind of very institutionally based. And then on the other hand, we have these new kinds of archives that are popping up that are called community archives. And we've been recently reading Michelle Caswell's work, Urgent Archives, about the idea of making collections around particular groups whose visibility is obscured in these more institutional archives, but not only, you know, creating a space of representation, but also fostering projects of resistance of, you know, social justice projects through the archival work that the community archives are doing. And I think the Center for Folklore Studies Archive actually exists kind of in between these two categories. So we're at a university, but we're a bottom-up archive. So there was no plan from on high to create this archive, even though it's part of, in the United States, almost every folklore program has a similar, it has an archive attached to it. But these are really bottom-up efforts that are kind of organically constructed, many hands, and generally lack professional resources. So we're lucky to have Jasper with us now, who has some background in our archival work, but often our archives, our folklore archives, are dependent upon student labor, people who have not been professionally trained. So that's where we are. And then in the, I would say the 2000 teens, I became the director of the Center for Folklore Studies, and we had this enormous student ethnographic collection, which is based on students going out and doing individual research on different kinds of genres. And I really wanted to move away from that model because it felt somewhat old-fashioned, towards reorienting our collecting as kind of group projects that still might be conducted by students, but that we would all be collecting the same kinds of things, right? And as we reoriented our coursework to do that kind of collecting, we found ourselves responding to community requests that arise out of ongoing conversations. I guess I would stress three things about the examples that we're going to present to you. These examples rely on us having resources, especially people who make this kind of archival development possible. The second thing I would say is both of our examples kind of highlight the ongoingness of the work, the way any of these projects might exceed any particular course we might be teaching and have a life of their own. And then the crucial role of the archive and archival staff as a kind of anchor that allows us to continue to collect past our initial intervention. So slide 2, Jasper. So the first example really arises out of a research interest of mine. In 2012, which seems like ages ago now, I hosted a conference that brought people together who were doing international service delegations to Central America. And most of the people that I had invited had been involved in 1980s era solidarity activism, but finding themselves in academic positions, they had kind of used those older networks to construct educational programs that would revolve around short-term study abroad. And this was a time of increased volunteering in the United States. It became a real, movement. People were going all over the place doing all kinds of voluntary work. And there are several reasons for that I won't go into. But by the late 2000s, those of us who were working in Central America began to interrogate our practices, recognizing that the work we were doing had lost its activist edge and had turned into a kind of niche form of tourism. So at this conference, a Columbus area activist, Mark Stansbury, attended. And as we were talking about these issues arising out of these various projects we had, he raised his hand and he said, Columbus had a very vibrant solidarity activist group in the 1980s. And that raised for us, and I had no idea, I wasn't here in the 1980s, but it raised for us this issue of the invisibility of grassroots activist work, especially the kinds of projects that grow and address, a specific situation, and then they decline over time or as people move on to other things. And so the materials that group collects to kind of document its work or even do its work ends up in many people's attics and boxes and drawers, totally dispersed. And so if you're trying to then go back and look at the history, folklore, development of that movement, it's very hard to find the sources, right? So in 2014, I had the opportunity to teach an ethnographic methods course, and I contacted Mark and asked him if he would like to have the Columbus Copiapayo Sister City group be our theme for that course. And he was delighted. He told me he had most of the records of the organization in a now closed church, which used to have an office that they worked out of. So it was sitting there kind of rotting away in cardboard boxes. And he contacted a friend of his, Tim Wagner, who still had connections with many of the people who had been involved. So Tim and Mark introduced my students to those resources, and the students began doing interviews and digitizing and organizing these very disorganized records. So that was the course. And of course, as people learned that this was going on, more people contacted us, and it's kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger, and so spilled over the confines of the class. But luckily, we had a student, Chris Johnson, who had, again, some previous archival experience, and we were able to fund him over the summer to complete the collection, to finalize a finding guide, all of these very important aspects of, like, once you get the materials, what do you do with them? How do you accession them in a responsible way? Next slide. Okay, so these are all the things I just talked about all of that. These are all the things we did. And the illustration is kind of interesting. There was a woman, Martha McFerrin, who was a middle school Spanish teacher. And in the midst of the El Salvadoran Civil War, she took a group of middle schoolers down to this war zone to have an exchange with the young people in Copiapayo, and brought back these drawings, children's drawings of the community. So we have those, the digitized versions of those. Can you give me the next slide? What was important? Well, there were many things that were important about this project, but one of the very important aspects of the work that this solidarity group had done was when they went down to visit the community in conflict, they were taking testimony about a massacre that had occurred in the early 1980s that caused the remaining Copapayans to flee across the Honduran border and live in a refugee camp for several years. And then that group decided they were going to repatriate against the wishes of the military dictatorship in El Salvador. And so they went back into the war zone, restarted their community, and that's when the Columbus Copiapayo organization started visiting them. So our North American volunteers were taking testimony about that massacre. And that massacre is very underdocumented in El Salvador. So we had English translations of the testimony of these villagers that didn't exist anywhere else. So almost immediately after we put this collection, the description of this collection online, we had students from the University of San Salvador contacting us to find out more so that they could use these materials to understand their own history. So next slide, please. Again, once we had done the initial, bulk of the work, we had a collection, it existed online. And a year later, when Janice de la Puente returned to Columbus, she had been a member of the Columbus Copipayo Sister City organization. She had remained in El Salvador for 25 years. Returned in 2015, we were able to get an interview with her that then really enriched the perspective that we were able to present, because she obviously had a much more rooted experience than people who were just traveling to the community for a couple of weeks, right? Last year, again, we had someone who found us online, Karen Kiefer, who had been the first person to visit the community. She was a student organizer before this Columbus area organization was really off the ground. So it started as a student project. And then when the students left, community residents took it up. So having her materials and her interview again provided just another level of perspective to the collection. And we were really only able to offer Karen to digitize her materials because we had a graduate research associate that we could assign to do the work of digitizing and interviewing that the former student group had done for the original collection. So again, it was really what we could do was dependent upon who we had to put the hours in, because as you know, if you are archivists, that accessioning takes lots and lots of time and care and detail. Next slide. This collection also resulted, as I said, in immediate interest on the part of researchers, not only the students from the University of San Salvador, but also a historian, Molly Todd, who was interested in developing the story of Midwestern solidarity activism during this period. The history that exists focuses upon the East Coast, the West Coast, and the US-Mexican border, where people fleeing the conflict were crossing over. And there had been very little attention to what was going on in the Midwest, but actually there was a great deal of activity here. It was a highly networked, highly organized operation centered in Wisconsin, but Ohio had significant activity in this movement. So Molly has just published a book, which I recommend to all of you, that is partially based on the materials that we were able to organize for Mark Stansberry. Okay, last slide. Yeah, so one of the things that we had to think about as we were doing this community engaged collecting is what happens if you have materials that are potentially harmful, and how do you protect the identities of people who whose private information is part of this record of this organization. So in this case, one of the contributors was a lawyer, and she was working on an asylum case for a woman who had come from El Salvador and was seeking asylum in the United States. She was granted asylum based on political persecution, and she still lives in Columbus. But when we tried to reach out to her as we were doing this collection, she declined to be interviewed because she has moved on in her life, and she was no longer interested in that kind of publicity. So we have, in fact, a dark archive within the Columbus Copipayo collection And anyone who wishes to look at these materials would need to go through the archivist and talk about why they need to see them, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of one of the things that you run into as you're developing this work. You never know what's going to be in those boxes. And we always want to be responsible and think first about the people rather than the stuff. And with that, I guess, so that's my first example, and that was kind of the first instantiation of an ethnographic field school that Jasper is going to tell us a little bit about.
Great, thank you, Katie. Yeah, I want to pick up some of the threads of how student ethnographic fieldwork that happens in these kinds of courses leads on to other kinds of projects, as well as how we're trying to attend to silences that might exist in the record, in the archival record, in the historical record, and in the study of folklore, as well as sort of how folklore archives might do something that's a little bit outside of their purview in assembling some of these collections through community engaged work. So this is one of our sort of central programs at the Center for Folklore Studies Archives, and the Center for Folklore Studies is the Ohio Field School. It's an experiential learning service project that also teaches folklore students the ethnographic methods that you'll need to be a sort of a folklore studies scholar. And answering this question about how do Appalachian Ohioans create a sense of place in a changing environment. It's a very broad research question that allows us to do a lot of different kinds of collaborations. And so if you don't know, Appalachia is a region, a mountain region in the eastern United States that goes north to south across from western New York all the way down to sort of Mississippi and Alabama. And so it does cross through Ohio in part of that, and it has a history and a legacy of extractive industry, and historically has been marginalized compared to the rest of the state. And so often those environmental and social changes are occurring without being documented. And so we see our role as helping to document those changes while also giving an outside perspective when we're asked to. So we take the time to value what people value. This is a community collaborative project. So really the projects are set in accordance with community partners. What is something that they define or that they identify as a project that would be appropriate for us and the students to work on, that we can then create public accessible records about by archiving the ethnographic work that the students do, as well as creating digital galleries that are often kind of like landing pages or billboards in a way for the work that our community partners are doing in order to affect meaningful and positive progressive change in their communities. So at the root of this project is a sense of collaborative ethnography. So we use this book that's in the bottom right-hand corner there, Doing Ethnography Today, by Elizabeth Campbell, who's trained as a folklorist, and Eric Lassiter, to talk about what are the possibilities of doing ethnography in a non-extractive way, in a collaborative way that actually builds together with community partners, builds knowledge together, rather than seeing people as ethnographic informants or interlocutors with people who are actually building the research with us. So we find that really decenters the ethnographer-informant kind of relationship and thinks about something that's a generative relationship that continually shapes the research goals and outcomes as the project takes shape. It also locates new audiences, so it sees a very broad public audience, but also looking outside the sort of usual institutional and disciplinary audiences that our kind of scholarship might locate. It normally consists of small, varied projects that sort of form a larger sort of coming together of projects. So we'll do these projects normally about a semester long with students, but with community partners over time, towards often a praxis-based objective. So we're also seeing ourselves as agents of making some of these changes. So what are these positive changes that are happening? How do we support those in these communities that we work with through our skills and resources as folklore studies scholars at the land-grant university? One important thing about collaborative ethnography, as both of these textbooks will demonstrate, is that it resists theorization. It really resists any kind of modeling or theorizing about it because it's inherently emergent. It tends to these questions, these concepts, these ideas that actually emerge from the work and the relationship building that happens in collaborative ethnography. So the relationships are really what's centered more than any research question or thesis or topic or method. It's always the relationship is the core thing. So we're trying to build off of that, and then what emerges from that is really what we go on to do. And what we found is that our community partners in the part of Southeast Ohio where we're working, actually, this really maps on perfectly to how they see themselves as connecting to institutional bases of knowledge as well. So this is from a list of principles from John Winenberg, who's one of our really close community partners in Southeast Ohio. He runs a small grassroots community organization. And so he has these are his principles. I won't go through them all there, but it's collaborative. It's directed towards always benefiting the community first and letting the community lead and setting expectations, focuses on their assets, celebrates rather than detracts, as many studies in Appalachia do that focus on the deficits. It's always incremental, small, building small and sustainably, rather than promising one big project and being one and done, and then they never see you again. And it researches and documents while continually sharing results with the community. So it's a very iterative process. So when John showed me this list of his principles, I was extremely excited because I was like, oh, wow, how often is it that a community partner and an institutional partner are literally on the same page when it comes to what values they expect from each other? So this is just a sort of a charting out to show how the student project then becomes something else. And will get me to the collection that I'm actually here to talk about. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see a very handsome gentleman standing in the forest there, who's also on the call here, Harry Ivory, who with Janice, his sister, helped us on a project, and we sort of collaborated on a project documenting the cemetery in Renville, Ohio, which was a former coal mining town and was unique in the area as it was the only town where the company would employ Black workers and the only place that Black workers and their families could live. So we were trying to document the cemetery as a place of return, as this place has demographically declined over the past 100 years, and think about the meaning of this place as a place of return. So Lydia Smith and Jake Kopinski, who are the two students who are standing there, worked very closely with Harry and Janice on this project, and did the interviews and the documentation that we typically do in the field school, and created a digital gallery, which you can see to the right as a website of the cemetery, which then continued to grow. So we continued to collaborate over time. Jake and Lydia moved forward with several other projects with Harry and Janice, which I won't go into, but there are several, and they're all incredible, and they're amazing. And I can link out to those for anyone who's interested. The next photo there on the right is us all presenting together at the Appalachian Studies Association conference last year to talk about this sort of way that we've crafted community narratives together in this collaborative process. And so with that and a couple other things that we did that I don't quite have time to get into, you get the sense of how this collaborative work ends up being, in the words of Marcus there, formed as an atelier of small projects, right? Like these small projects that you can actually achieve over time build towards a more whole, cohesive, collaborative picture where we're both sort of building knowledge together. And I hope that's how you feel too, Harry, since you're on here right now. Feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. So the sense that we're building these things together and our expectations are set by each other and met towards each other out of the field school sort of model. So in 2021, we had anticipated, because of COVID, we were not able to do the field school in the way we had initially intended to. So we looked at doing some more digital kind of projects that students would be able to do at a distance, lacking that period of intense on-site research that they typically do. And so Harry and Janice had identified papers that belong to their uncle, Joseph T. Williams, or Uncle Joe, that we might help them digitize and sort of think about what projects could arise from those into the future. So we weren't able to do that project during the field school. We didn't have enough students that semester, actually. So during that summer, Harry and I sort of got all these papers together and went through and organized them. Harry and Janice had had, in a way, I guess if this is the right word to use, rescued them from a house that was being demolished, I believe, and collected them. And Harry had been holding on to them for some years, and Janice has holding on to them for some years. And so it came together like, okay, well, what do we do with this collection? So I said, well, as archivists, one thing that we could help you do is box them up and figure out, what's in the collection, create a finding aid, and sort of sort things out so that if you can't hold on to it, then maybe there's a historic preservation organization or a museum or another archive that may maybe be able to hold it, because that's outside of what we would take physically for the Center for Folklore Studies archives. So we did that. We boxed up everything. And over time, we sort of went through everything and found this incredible record that Harry and Janice had already identified as being valuable in the past. Incredible record of Black life in the early 20th century in Appalachian, Ohio, in this coal camp. So for us at that point in time, it was thinking about how do we reskill what we do. I'm an ethnographer of material culture and craft. I have a background in museums. And museum collection practices and maintenance, and less in archiving paper documents and things like that. But so how can I reskill and retrain myself in those things, bring my preservation, bring my skills in museum practices and collections management into archiving as well? How can we do work at a distance during a pandemic that's also collaborative, and think about the ways that there are principles as ethnographers that are also applied in other senses? How do we respond to stories that need to be told in our historic context at a time when Black life is being erased in areas like Appalachia? If you all in an international context are thinking about Appalachia, you're almost always thinking of a vision of whiteness, right? And that's not the case that Appalachia has been for Appalachia in a historical context. So how do we reinstantiate that? How do we revive the fact that Black life was so critical to a lot of these towns in Appalachia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and continually to today, while also thinking that some of those things are actually outside of our purview as a folklore archive in the institutional sense that we described earlier. So we also sort of brought in regional partners then. Black in Appalachia is a fantastic nonprofit that does public history work around documenting Black life in Appalachia. So we also brought them in as well to start a large-scale scanning project. Once Harry and I had a sort of an idea of understanding what was in this collection, it's over 4,000 items. We reached out to Black in Appalachia, who brought a researcher up to Columbus and worked with us on scanning almost the entire collection as well. So it's all been digitized at this point. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, these are just some of the items that are in the collection. In the top left-hand corner, there's the UMWA treasure receipts for somebody paying dues. The UMWA is the United Mine Workers of America. It was at one point in time the most powerful labor union in the United States and the most significant labor union in the United States. Really, the labor movement kind of started in these coal fields in Southeast Ohio in the United States. And so here we have people who were active in that labor movement. Some photographs you can see there. Here in the bottom, sort of in the bottom right, we have political things like, should we amend the state constitution to allow light wines and beers at a time when the US was prohibiting the sale of alcohol everywhere? Here we can see in the middle, Uncle Joe served as the town clerk in many cases. And here, this is actually a handwritten birth certificate from two Italian immigrants into this coal camp. So Virgil Piznodi or Pizzodi and Mary Tizzi, who are had this baby, and it's literally written out here on a small scrap of paper, as well as their family letters too, that really talk about the intersections and connections of people moving throughout the United States, and how Renville as a coal town was a place that people came to in the late 19th century after Reconstruction as a way to sort of re-envision Black life and Black political and social life that then sort of matriculated out into the greater United States. So all of that went into, this were things that we all discovered through this process. So, doing something that's more of a typical kind of folklore project through our field schools, leading into this work directed by a need that was articulated by Harry and Janice, that we look at these papers, they knew they were important, but we needed to bring together some more skill sets to really discover what was in there and find how we can show it to the world. So working at these scanning stations together was this beautiful coming together of diverse positionalities, skills, histories, and different kinds of relationships to the materials. So there's Celine Lamb working in the background, Jake Kopinski, who originally worked with Harry in the Field School Project, Alana Norwood, who's the researcher from Black in Appalachia, and there's Harry there too. So we're just sitting around scanning and talking about what we're seeing. And Alana would say, I'm really interested in these mother and daughter relationships I'm seeing in these personal records, or oh, these are kind of like spicy things where people are talking about relationships that they have in the town. And I was, getting super excited about wherever I was seeing things about labor history and environment. So we're all telling these stories about bringing in the contextual information that we have there into bear and creating sort of narratives while we're talking through this. And then also it's a spot to start, thinking about how we can train each other in different kinds of archival processes, learning the local history, and thinking about what the approach to the materials might be. As a material culture scholar, I see every single scrap of paper that's in that collection as an artifact, right? An artifact that can tell us so much just by looking at what kind of paper it's on. So just a couple of examples, we were able to look at the kind of, I could look at some of the paper and understand if there was no date on it, approximately what year it might be from based on the different kind of ink that I saw on the paper. Alana and Harry in this wonderful moment where sort of Alana was, you can see on her screen there, the Excel database that we were using to log all of our digitization. Alana was training Harry in how to input data into the Excel spreadsheet, but Alana was never taught how to read cursive handwriting. So Harry was teaching Alana how to read cursive handwriting at the same moment. So it's like this beautiful kind of intergenerational connection happening too. And then again, like the fact that we're all going through this, we're all looking at these items individually, allows us to create some collaborative narratives around what's happening too, in ways with people who we identify with. So this collection has Uncle Joe's stepfather, B.A. Tyree stuff in it. And I'm now like B.A. Tyree obsessed. I can't stop talking about him all the time. So you find these people who you identify with in the collection too, and then create those connections. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. So thinking about, how that doing these kind of institutional, starting in an institutional base with our projects, yet going out with collaborative methodologies really changes kind of who we are and what we do. So thinking about what happens when we let that relationship take the lead brings us in some areas that we don't necessarily normally think of as folklore or practices that we don't necessarily think of as archival practices. So we're kind of in this space where we're thinking about these questions about what's the tension there. We're still representing a center, we're still representing an institution, yet we are also doing these collaborative projects that take us in vastly different directions. Katie, I don't know, you want me to keep on talking, or do you want to take these questions up?
I'll give you a breather and just sort of reiterate the questions that we came up with. So I guess what we'd like to do, if that's appropriate for this setting, is ask you all, having heard a little bit about the kinds of projects we're engaged with now, what we need to be thinking about moving forward. Our first question was, when you're doing collecting and research from this relational place, what does that do to the identity of your archive? And does that even matter? One concern is that it might appear that we don't have a list of priorities about what we take and what we don't take, right? Given the way in which our projects sort of emerge out of the interactions, conversations, friendships that we're making. And then our second question is, how does that to relate to our institutional precarity? Because we do have some resources as we're part of the university, but we are very, very low on the totem pole here at Ohio State University. And in fact, a few years ago, we were in danger of being shut down altogether because we couldn't articulate our value to an audience that didn't really understand or appreciate this kind of work. And that leads us again to this question of, well, how can we tell our story more effectively? How can we make this work shine in a way that will bring us the resources we need to do more of it, which is, I think, what Jasper and I both would really love to do. So I'll stop there. And if anybody has any thoughts or questions for us, I know we just raced right through that, and there's plenty more to say, but the floor is yours.